Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. Today we're going to talk about how to EQ vocals. Unless you're making only instrumental music all the time, vocals are a critical part of your process. Arguably, the lead vocal is the most important track in the session. So we want to make sure we have a lot of good tools available to us to make sure that the lead vocal sounds as good as possible. One of those tools, of course, is EQ, and today we're going to talk about that. Before we do, however, if you don't have my 5-step mix guide, it's really kind of the required reading to learn how to mix, especially the way that I do it. So if you haven't checked it out yet, it's 100% free. It's a quick read. You can read it in one sitting. Just go to 5stepmix.com to download your free copy. Before we dive into things like frequencies, we need to talk about the elephant in the room. If you are mixing your vocal in solo, you're shooting yourself in the foot. What I mean is, if when you're making all your EQ and compression and effects decisions, when you're listening to just the vocal, meaning you solo the vocal and then make all of your decisions, you're probably fighting a battle that really you can't win. Because how the vocal sounds by itself is almost necessarily vastly different from how it sounds in the mix. So context matters, mixing the vocal in the context of everything else. That doesn't mean that pushing the solo button is wrong. It just means don't live there and expect what it sounds like in solo to translate once you bring the instruments back in. Years ago, when I worked for Sweetwater, Blue Microphones came to present some of their new models. So they've got inexpensive models, and they've got some really cool high-end mics as well. And one of the things they came in to say was, our microphones have a sound. It was interesting. It was kind of refreshing because a lot of microphone companies come in and they show you charts that show, look how flat the frequency response is of our microphones. They're the flattest in the industry and blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But Blue came in and said, no, our microphones are not flat at all. They're kind of tuned to give a certain sound. So they have an EQ curve to them that will sound great on some sources and maybe bad on other sources. And their whole kind of twist on that was that this is a benefit. Instead of just recording a sterile, plain sound, they're actually going ahead and shaping the sound right at the source with the microphone to give a better tone. And one of the stories they told was there was one of the artists or engineers or producers that worked with their microphones was in the studio working on a vocal mix. And I want to say it was like a major label release, and they worked on it for like 2 days, just the vocal. And when they finally got a vocal mix that sounded perfect in the mix, they came in to listen, and when they soloed the vocal, it sounded terrible. It was thin, didn't have any of the good stuff you think a vocal should have. It sounded like something was wrong, actually. But when they dropped it into the mix, it was perfect. Now, I don't know what the song was, or I haven't heard it myself, but that story holds up, and I've found that to be true for myself. And this isn't just a vocal thing, by the way. This applies to really anything. Have you ever mixed a snare drum by itself, and it sounds one way, and then you listen to the entire drum kit or the entire mix, and the snare sounds completely different? Yeah, that's just the nature of what we do here. So rather than just being stubborn and putting your head down and soloing everything and just kind of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best, make sure that you are listening and even making your adjustments in context with everything else. You're going to get a better result, and you're probably going to get mixes done faster because of it, because you're not just spinning your wheels. So the kind of takeaway from this is the soloed vocal is probably going to sound thinner and quote unquote worse than you think it should, but that's actually going to make it sit in the mix a lot better. Since we're about to talk about things like frequencies, I decided to just go all in on the nerd side of me and put together a little spreadsheet to help us think through the frequencies of a vocal, what they do, and what they mean to the final tone of the vocal. So one of the things, I'm going to go ahead and start filling this out, but if you don't know these frequency ranges, so like everything here will be in hertz. If you don't know what 80 hertz sounds like really when I say 80 hertz, you have a pretty good idea in your head of what that sounds like. If that's not true, then that's where you probably need to spend a good amount of time. That's your homework for the next week or so, is to become intimately familiar with what the different frequency ranges sound like, because 50 hertz is unbelievably different from 500 hertz or even 200 hertz or even 100 hertz. They're so different. And if you don't recognize that, you're going to just have a hard time mixing. So if frequencies are the currency that we use, when we're mixing a song, then it makes sense that we become intimately familiar with that. So whatever line of work you're in, there are specific details and kind of it's understood that you at least have this baseline understanding of how the job works or how the industry works. Understanding what the different frequencies sound like, that's kind of job number one before you can have any hope of really getting the rest of the puzzle in place, okay? And one way to do that is you just pull a song, a full mix into your DAW, and just boost different frequencies and listen to what things are prominent there. And you'll start to learn, okay, here's the stuff that resides down at 50 hertz. Here's the stuff that lives at 250. Here's the difference between them. It's just work, right? It's just work, but it's well worth your time, trust me. Okay, so the 5 ranges that we're going to talk about in this video, and how you divide these up is completely arbitrary. This is kind of where it falls for me today. If you watch another video where I've talked about this, I probably put different frequencies, and that's fine. It's not an exact science. This is art. But we're going to get nerdy anyway. So lows, low mids, mids, high mids, and highs. So the lows from 0 to 80, the low mids 80 to 300-ish, mids 300 to 1,000, high mids 1,000 to 5K, and then high frequencies 5K and up. Even now as I'm saying that, I could maybe move this one up a little bit higher. But anyway, we're going to stick with that for now. We're going to talk through 3 things for each of these sets of frequencies. So the first is none of these frequencies, with the exception of maybe one, are bad on vocals, but they can be. And the badness can come in 2 forms. It can come in that particular frequency range being too loud, or that particular frequency range being too quiet, right? So it might need an EQ boost or an EQ cut to adjust for how it is naturally. And then there are good things about that frequency range as well. So the thumbs up column is going to talk about what's good about each of these frequencies, specifically for vocals. And then this is what happens when there's too much of this frequency with the up arrow. And then the down arrow is what happens when there's not enough of this frequency. So this is what's good about this range. This is what happens when you have too much. This is what happens when you have too little, okay? I have completely activated the inner nerd now, so let's dive in. So low frequencies, I almost wanted to end with this, but we'll start here just to go down the line. The good thing about the really low stuff is that there's boom there. Now, why would that be a good thing on a vocal? Really, only if you're doing like a cappella vocals and you need a bass part that rattles the subwoofer, or if you're doing like beatboxing and you need that low, like you need that to have a big, boomy low end to it. That's delightful. Otherwise, the low frequencies are persona non grata for me in a vocal mix. There's not much use for them in the final vocal. They're just problematic. So if there's too much there, then it's boomy. So the difference is boom is a good word, boomy is a bad word apparently. And if there's not enough in 80 hertz or below, I would say that's great. Wonderful. That means probably somebody used a high-pass filter during recording, and that's great. Good to go. I don't want it to be thin. We don't want to take out tons of frequencies, but like 80, 50, and below down in there, good riddance. I don't need you in my vocal. Low mid. So this is where a lot of your attention will be in the low mid area because a lot of instruments have their fundamental frequencies down there. But I would say for the low mids, when it's right, it sounds nice and warm. The vocal has a warmth to it. If it's too much, however, the vocal can sound muddy, and if there's not enough, it can sound pretty thin, okay? So when everything's good in the low mids, it's got a nice warmth to it. Not too much, not too little. When there's too much in the low mids, it has this kind of sort of a muddy sound that gives you a headache and interferes with all the other instruments in the track. And if you go too far and maybe try to correct the muddiness, it can sound thin, sometimes overly thin. And like we said, it's probably going to be thinner than you think it needs to be in the final mix, but there's obviously you can go too far and just make it completely wimpy, if that makes sense. All right, 300 to 1,000 hertz. This is where I would say a lot of fullness comes in. To me, when I think of 300 or like 500 hertz, I think of, for some reason, like the alto section of a choir. So if you have sung in choir before, you know the altos, the sopranos sing the highest, the altos are the female singers that sing lower, so they're just above the tenors. So I kind of think of it as like, ooh, like that's kind of mid-range to me, especially in like 500 to 800 hertz or so. And there's a lot of fullness and beauty there. Like imagine a choir without the altos. You lose so much of the fullness because they bring in that kind of right there in the middle, that mid-range. You could say for the tenors as well a little bit if they're singing super high. But with a tenor, when they sing that high, there's a lot more. They have to push a lot more, so it's a different tone, right, than an alto kind of singing in her natural range. So it's full sounding. If there's too much in the mid range, then it kind of, to my ear, sounds kind of honky. It's a little bit like when you cover your mouth like this. You notice how you lose the highs and the lows in my voice when I do that, because my hand's literally blocking it, and it kind of almost sounds muffled, but it's more that wah, 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 that mid-range that kind of becomes prominent when there's too much in the mids. So I find myself cutting in this area quite a bit, because that's usually something that I find in the vocal. And then if there's not enough mid-range, it can sound what I would call hollow or maybe tubby, where it honestly sounds affected, like someone went in and scooped out all the mids. If you scoop it out too much, it starts to just sound kind of unnatural and hollow, like there's an emptiness to the vocal. All right, high mids. There's two words that came to mind when talking about the high mids: grit and clarity. So if I'm singing like a rock vocal and I'm like, that grittiness that's there, that sits up there in the high mid. Same with like the grit on electric guitars, things like that. That's the grittiness there. So that needs to cut through, especially in a rock mix. For something that's more ballad-like, perhaps the right answer is clarity. So a lot of the sibilant sounds, S's and T's, and a lot of the clarity of the vocal happens down in that high mid. You could argue the highs as well, but we're going to stick with that for here. Now, if there's too much of the high mid frequencies, the vocal sounds nasal. Another word for this would just be annoying. It's kind of like those frequencies. Whew, my ear is, I think, especially sensitive to them, because when I hear that, I get rid of it real quickly because it's super annoying. But you don't need them. If they're gone entirely, that's not a good thing, because if you take them out too much, then the vocal sounds muffled. It sounds more like this. You lose all the highs and all that detail and clarity that's there. And then the high frequencies, a little different from the high mids, but not by much. This is where obviously the brightness is and the quote-unquote airiness. So if a vocal has a lot of air to it, typically that's up around 8K to 10K, 12K, 16K, way up there, that nice brightness of like a female ballad vocal, for example. But of course, if there's too much here, both in just high frequencies and then on the sibilant sounds like S's and T's, then it can be quite hajarsh, I can't type, goodness gracious, quite harsh. And a harsh vocal makes people want to turn down the mix, and that's not good. We need it to be clear, we need it to cut through in a good way, but too much and it's harsh. And kind of the same thing here, if there's not enough highs there, the vocal sounds muffled. So here is my thesis on where frequencies live for a vocal, where your brain needs to be when you're thinking about approaching a vocal. We'll talk about what questions to ask yourself in just a second. But I would encourage you, take a screenshot of this, print it out, keep it next to your mix position. This might be a helpful resource for you. And maybe create your own. Maybe you don't agree with my words here. The specific words are fairly subjective, but the idea is each of these ranges has a pretty specific sound. When it comes to a vocal, the more you can learn that and make that a part of your regular vocabulary, the better off your mixes will be. Now, part of me wanted to play examples of all of these for you, but I think that's a waste of time. I think you're going to do that next time you sit down to mix a song. You're going to go in and boost and cut each of these ranges and hear it for yourself on your own vocal track that you're working on. So I think that's a better use of time, is to let you hear that and really kind of cement it in your mind. But I've given you kind of the framework to use for that. Finally, here are a couple of questions you can ask yourself when you're mixing a vocal to help you figure out what needs to happen. Because I imagine it's a pretty common thing that you sit down and there's a vocal and you say, okay, it's not right, it's not done, but I don't know what to do next. I would say play bingo with it, right? Pull up this list of the different words that we put out in front of us and say, okay, this vocal sounds a little boomy. Great. Let's go make sure there's not too much down in the 0 to 80 hertz. And then we zoom back out and say, well, okay, but now the vocal sounds kind of nasal. Okay, cool. Let's go do a cut in the upper mid somewhere. And then we say, well, the vocal is a little thin. Oh, it's thin? Let's boost some of the low mids just a little bit to give it some added warmth. All of these are legit things. So whichever one's the biggest problem, fix that first and then ask yourself the question again until it's feeling good. If you find yourself doing huge EQ moves, that may be the right decision, or you may need to stop and say, am I doing like a 12 dB boost in the high frequencies? That might be a little bit much. So give yourself kind of catch yourself when you do big dramatic movements, just to make sure it's the right move. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's nice to kind of just doubt yourself occasionally in those situations. And then finally, if you have something like say we said the vocal sounds muddy, which is the low mid range, we might say, okay, is the vocal muddy or not? Because what we're doing is we should be listening to that vocal with everything else in the mix. And if the vocal sounds muddy, the first thing I'll do is mute the vocal and see if I still hear the muddiness. If I do still hear the muddiness, then it's not the vocal, or it's not only the vocal that's contributing to this mud. So it's probably, for me, it's usually like a guitar or maybe a bass or a piano that's also contributing to the mud. But if I mute the vocal and the muddiness goes away, now I know with confidence that the muddiness has to do with the vocal, and then I can dive in and fix that however I need to. But the mute button is one of the unsung heroes of a mix session, because you can identify a problem, but then just to make sure you've located the problem, mute the thing you're about to tweak and see if the problem goes away. If it does, you're permission granted, move forward. If not, then you know that it's not the source or the only source of that problem, so you can make smart decisions from there. Hope this video was helpful for you and got you excited to go work on a vocal mix. What are your vocal EQ tips? Leave a comment below and let us know. And if you haven't checked out the 5-Step Mix Guide, again, it's free. It will help you transform your mixes. Go to 5stepmix.com and get your copy today. Thanks for watching. See ya.